"Don't clap, you're embarrassing." Those were the words that broke something in me, the words my son leaned over and hissed at me as though I were not his mother, but some stranger who had blundered into his circle of polite society. He said it quickly, sharply, like a man delivering a reprimand to a child who should have known better, and I felt the pressure of his hand over mine, not affectionate, not protective, but silencing, commanding, like a lid pressed over a boiling pot. I remember the way he held my hand down against the soft velvet of the armrest, the warmth of his palm not bringing comfort, but instead pushing me deeper into the chair as though he wanted to make me disappear into the upholstery, a gesture that told me with more force than words that my presence was tolerated, but my joy was not. I was not allowed to show it, not allowed to let it spill from me, even though the music demanded release. I was 76 years old and my hands had clapped for him when he was a boy playing piano scales badly in our living room, clapped for his first hesitant role in a school play, clapped for him when he crossed a graduation stage, clapped when he brought his firstborn home and placed that tiny, wailing life into my arms. But there in the Grand Opera House, under a ceiling heavy with chandeliers and centuries of music, I was told that my hands had no right to make noise anymore. I should explain who I am, though I hesitate, because part of me still wants to be known not by name or age, but by the sound of my heart when it rises to meet a voice on stage. But the truth is simpler. I am a widow, 76 years old, living, alone in a modest apartment filled with books, photographs, and a record player that spins my memories back to life when I am brave enough to switch it on. I have 3 children, though I often feel as though I have none, because distance grows, not just in miles, but in the quiet corrections, the little humiliations, the subtle ways they remind me I am old and inconvenient. But that night at the opera, I did not feel old. I felt alive. Fully. Like the girl I once was when my late husband took me to see La Traviata on a student discount, when we sat in the very last row and shared a program between us, whispering translations to each other, laughing softly when we missed a phrase, and crying openly when the soprano collapsed in her final aria. He used to squeeze my hands so hard during the crescendos that I thought I might break, but I never asked him to stop. I loved that pressure, that urgency, that unashamed surrender to sound. So when, all these years later, the orchestra swelled and the soprano's voice climbed like it was carrying me to the heavens, my hands lifted on their own, almost like wings, and I clapped with the rhythm of gratitude, the instinct of someone who has waited decades to feel music in her chest again. It was not loud, not rude, not premature. I clapped because my body demanded it, because joy needs exit as much as breath needs escape. Yet to my son it was vulgar, embarrassing, unfit for the careful image he had constructed of himself as a sophisticated patron of the arts. He leaned close, and in that whispered rebuke, I heard not just the correction of a small social misstep, but a lifetime of dismissal. Don't clap. Don't laugh too loud. Don't tell that story again. Don't wear that dress. Don't speak when no one asks. Don't remind us that you still live. Don't make us notice you. I had heard it all before in different tones, through rolled eyes, through careful silences, through the way invitations to family dinners always arrived last minute, as though I were an afterthought or a burden. But somehow, this command cut sharper. Because it came at the moment when I felt most like myself, when I was not waiting in a kitchen to be told dinner was ready, not sitting quietly on a sofa while others talked over me, but when I was lifted by music into a place where I could forget my age, my loneliness, my invisibility. To be dragged back down with those words was crueler than if he had simply ignored me. And yet, in the very same instant, something unexpected happened. The conductor, white hair flying, coattails whipping like wings, turned his head sharply toward our row, his baton suspended mid-air, and he pointed at me, Not at my son, not at the well-dressed woman in pearls beside him, not at anyone else. At me, the old woman in a plain navy dress, sitting a little too upright because my back ached, but my spirit refused to sag. His eyes caught mine, and though the moment lasted no more than a heartbeat, it felt as though the entire hall had shifted its gaze. He did not scold, did not frown. He smiled, a quick, knowing smile, and then lifted his arms again and drew the orchestra back into the storm of sound. I froze, caught between shame and wonder. My son's hand tightened over mine, furious now, but I could still feel the weight of that baton, the silent acknowledgement that someone had seen me, that my applause, far from being embarrassing, had mattered enough to be noticed. That moment has lived with me since, haunting and healing in equal measure. I sit now in my small living room, the afternoon light filtering through lace curtains, the old record player humming as I place a worn vinyl of Verdi onto the turntable. And I remember not only the sting of my son's words, but the strange grace of the Maestro's gesture. It is a cruel trick of life to find recognition from strangers while being silenced by those you birthed, but it is also, perhaps, a gift, because it forced me to look beyond the narrow frame in which my children keep me and see that there is still a world that notices, still a stage that responds, still a place for my voice and my hands and my presence. I am 76, yes, and I live alone, yes, but I am not finished. I am not invisible. And though my son tried to quiet me that night, it was precisely his attempt to erase me that sharpened the edges of my being. I tell you this because introductions often begin with names and ages and addresses, with polite summaries of life's trajectory. But mine begins with that sentence, hissed in the half-dark of an opera house, because it explains everything about where I am now. I am a woman who was told not to clap, who was made to feel small for loving something too much, and who discovered in the same breath that love cannot be silenced if it is real. That night, something broke. Yes, but something also began. The true catalyst, the moment that reshaped the map of my heart, did not arrive in the first sting of my son's whispered command, though that was its prelude, nor in the fleeting kindness of the conductor's pointed gesture, though that was the spark, but rather in the silence that followed, in the heavy, suffocating aftermath when I realized what had actually happened in that grand hall. It was not about etiquette, not about applause at the wrong moment, not even about my son's embarrassment. It was about exclusion, the kind of deliberate shutting out that looks harmless from the outside but is devastating when you feel it in your bones. You see, after the curtain fell and the crowd rose in waves of chatter and laughter, I stood as well, adjusting my coat, still trembling from the music, and I turned to my son, hoping for a smile, a shared glance, something human to soften the sharpness of what had passed. Instead, he avoided my eyes, busying himself with his phone, muttering something to his wife about calling the car. He walked a step ahead, leaving me to follow behind like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. And as we moved with the crowd through the gilded corridors, I realized I was invisible to him, not just in that moment, but in his life. I was an accessory, a tag-along, someone to manage, not someone to cherish. When we reached the outer doors, the night air was cool and rich with the scent of rain on stone. Cars pulled up in a neat procession, doors opening, engines humming, women slipping in with practiced grace. My son's car arrived, and he opened the door for his wife with a polite half-bow that made me ache with memory, for I remembered when he used to open doors for me, when he was a boy eager to show his strength. He did not extend the same courtesy to me now. I slid into the back seat alone, and as the city lights smeared across the window, I heard them talking in low voices in the front, voices pitched carefully away from me, as though I were deaf or already gone. I pressed my hands together in my lap, The same hands that had once washed his clothes, cooked his meals, signed his permission slips, and I thought of how strange it was that the only time those hands had dared to clap freely in years they had been shamed into stillness. That was the true betrayal. Not just the silencing, but the rewriting of my role from mother to liability. Back at their house, which was polished and cold, with its granite counters and spotless glass, they poured themselves wine and left me with tea. I sat in the corner of the sofa, listening to them argue softly about logistics for the next day. Meetings, carpools, schedules, and it struck me with force that they lived in a world where my only function was to fit in quietly or not at all. When I finally rose to say goodnight, my son gave me a distracted peck on the cheek, his eyes never lifting from the glowing screen in his hand, and my daughter-in-law smiled politely the way one smiles at a tenant who pays rent on time but is otherwise unremarkable. I went to the guest room, a space that smelled faintly of lavender polish and had no trace of me in it, and I sat on the bed for a long time, staring at the blank white walls, feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. But the true catalyst was not even the humiliation of that night. It was the morning after, when I sat at their kitchen table with my cup of tea while they prepared for the day. My son, in his crisp suit, rattled off plans about clients and presentations. His wife scrolled on her tablet, answering emails with the quick flick of her manicured nails. I mentioned softly that the conductor had pointed at me, that perhaps he had noticed my applause, and I thought maybe, just maybe, they would laugh with me, or share in the small miracle, or at least acknowledge that for one brief second I had been seen by the very man who commanded the entire orchestra. Instead, my son frowned and said, "You imagine that, Mom. He points all the time. Don't make it bigger than it was." The dismissal was swift, cruel in its casualness. It wasn't just that he didn't believe me. It was that he refused to allow me even that one shard of validation. His words erased not just my memory, but the meaning I had attached to it, as though I were a child inventing stories. I sat there in silence, stirring sugar into my tea long after it had dissolved, and I felt something shift in me, a slow, quiet breaking that did not come with tears or anger, but with clarity. He would never see me again as I wished to be seen, not in triumph, not in weakness, not in joy. To him, I was already a shadow, and shadows are not meant to clap or speak or be noticed. In that moment, I realized the greatest violence is not the loud argument, the shouted insult, the slammed door, but the careful, polished erasure, the smooth hand that pats your arm and tells you to calm down, to sit quietly, to stop embarrassing yourself. That morning, as the car whisked him away to his important day, and I was left alone in the spotless kitchen with my cooling tea, I understood that I was being written out of the story of his life, edited out like an unnecessary line. That was the true catalyst, the recognition that the humiliation was not a slip, not an isolated moment of impatience, but part of a larger pattern, a lifelong arc bending toward my exclusion. And it was in that recognition that a different seed was planted, the seed of defiance. It was small, fragile, barely sprouting, but it was there, whispering to me that perhaps I did not need to wait for him to grant me permission to exist, that perhaps I could clap again when I chose, laugh when I chose, walk into a concert hall not as someone's embarrassing appendage, but as a woman with her own ears, her own voice, her own right to make noise. The catalyst was not in what he took from me, but in what I suddenly remembered I still had. The weeks after that night did not unfold with drama or loud confrontation, but with the kind of quiet diminishment that is harder to resist, because it does not declare itself as cruelty. It arrives in gestures that could almost be mistaken for practicality or absent-mindedness, yet I felt them as erosion, as the gradual scraping away of the little corners where I still lived. My son never spoke again of the opera, never mentioned the conductor's smile, never acknowledged my applause or his rebuke. He simply began to organize his life in such a way that I was no longer included in the places that mattered most to me. He and his wife continued to attend performances. I would see the tickets lying on the counter, glossy programs tucked into handbags, and when I asked about the music or the performers, they would answer politely but vaguely, as though discussing the weather with a neighbor, and they never offered to take me again. The silence around those outings was complete, and I learned soon enough that the message was simple. I was not welcome in that world any longer. At first, I tried to convince myself that perhaps they assumed I was tired, that the late nights were too much for me, that they were sparing me the strain. But that lie dissolved when I overheard them one evening whispering in the kitchen while I folded laundry in the next room. My daughter-in-law asked if they should invite me to the gala performance that weekend, and my son's reply came quick, clipped, final. No, it's too much trouble. She doesn't know how to behave. Those words were like a slow knife sliding between ribs, not because of their bluntness, but because of the certainty with which he spoke them, as though my entire presence in a public space had become a risk to his image, as though his own mother could damage the way he was seen. I folded the towel in my hand so tightly that the fabric trembled, but I made no sound, and I realized then that silence had become my defense, my shield against a reality that did not want me. Life in their house, where I was staying for a season because they insisted it was safer than my apartment after a fall, grew narrower by the day. The guest room felt less like a refuge and more like a waiting room in a building where no one ever came to collect me. I spent hours looking out the window at the street, watching other people come and go, children racing bicycles, women carrying groceries, couples walking hand in hand, and I thought about how many years I had lived at the center of life's noise. Cooking meals, bandaging scraped knees, staying up through fevers, cheering from bleachers, and how easily I had been moved from the center to the margins, as though I were furniture to be placed in a corner where it would not interfere with the design of the room. My contributions were invisible now, my presence tolerated but never celebrated. The escalation was not loud, but it was relentless. At family dinners, when neighbors or colleagues came by, introductions shifted subtly. I was not my mother, but this is Mary, delivered with a casualness that stripped the title of its weight. Conversations flowed around me, about art, about politics, about the markets, and when I tried to add a thought, the words seemed to fall flat, as though no one had heard them, or worse, as though they had and chosen not to respond. I began to hear in my own voice a kind of hesitation, a checking before speaking, a fear of overstepping into embarrassment again. The opera incident had seeped into everything, reminding me that even the smallest expression of enthusiasm could be turned against me. I remember one evening especially. They had guests for dinner, important ones, people from my son's work, men in press suits, women in sleek dresses. The conversation turned to music, to a recent symphony performance, and I thought perhaps this was a moment when I could contribute something, when my love of the art might not be unwelcome. I opened my mouth to speak about the soprano's interpretation, about how her phrasing reminded me of the recordings from the 70s, but before I could finish the thought, my son interrupted smoothly, smiling at his guest, steering the Ayamem's conversation away. He did not look at me, did not even acknowledge that I had spoken, and the others followed his lead, the moment vanishing as though it had never existed. I closed my mouth and lowered my eyes to the plate, the taste of food dull in my mouth, and I understood that my role was to be quiet, to fill a seat without filling the air. The small cruelties multiplied. My clothes were commented on. Maybe wear something more neutral, Mom, it blends better. And my laughter was corrected. Not so loud, Mom, the baby's asleep. Even my movements were managed. Just stay home tonight, it'll be easier. Each instruction was delivered in a tone of care, of consideration, but I recognized the pattern. Every word was a brick in the wall, being built between me and the life I wanted. The escalation was not in dramatic rejection, but in the slow replacement of my choices with theirs, until I felt like a guest in my own skin. I began to retreat, to make myself smaller in response. I lingered longer in the guest room, kept my voice low, arranged my days around their schedules so I would not be in the way. But inside, something resisted, some stubborn ember that refused to go out. I still had music. I still had my memories. I would sit at night with my old headphones, listening to recordings, clutching programs from decades ago, reminding myself of who I had been. Yet even that private joy felt tainted, because in the next room my son and his wife laughed about their plans, and I knew they believed I had no place in them. The first escalation, then, was not a single event, but a steady narrowing, a quiet campaign of omission. It was the way invitations stopped, the way conversations bypassed me, the way even my body seemed to be guided into silence and stillness. It was not loud cruelty, not open hostility, but the passive, polished erasure that hurts more because it is harder to name. And I, who had once believed myself strong, found that I was shrinking, not because I wanted to, but because the walls were pressing in. And yet, in that shrinking, in that unbearable smallness, I began to notice the ember more clearly. I could feel it, faint but hot. The reminder that I was still here, that despite their silence, I could still clap, still speak, still exist. The escalation was real, and it wounded me, but it also made me realize that if I did not act, I would disappear entirely, and I was not ready to disappear. The shift did not come like thunder, not with an argument or a slammed door, but with something quiet, something that began almost invisibly, as so many true changes do. It was a morning like any other, gray light slipping through the curtains, the sound of my son leaving for work, the quick heels of my daughter-in-law clicking on the hardwood floor, the kitchen filled with the smell of coffee I was never invited to, pour for myself. I sat at the table with my cup of tea and a book I had read so many times the pages were loose at the spine, and I felt that heavy fog settle over me again, the fog of being present but unseen. And then, as if guided by a hand I did not control, I reached into the drawer of the nightstand in the guest room and pulled out an old book of scores I had carried with me for decades. It was frayed at the corners, the paper yellowed, the ink smudged by years of being thumbed, but inside, slipped between the pages of Verdi's La Traviata, was something that stopped me cold, a faded ticket stub from 1968, my very first opera, The Waisa. Night my husband and I sat pressed against each other in the back row and let ourselves be consumed by music, greater than anything our young bodies had ever known. I held that ticket in my hand as though it were a relic, something sacred, and for the first time in months I felt not small but rooted, as though the paper connected me to a self I had almost forgotten. That night had been ours, mine and his, not borrowed from anyone else, not permitted by anyone else, not defined by whether I embarrassed anyone. It had been joy, pure and unashamed, and remembering it filled me with a kind of defiance I had not felt since before my children grew old enough to believe they were the ones who knew better. I realized then that I did not need my son's approval, his tickets, his invitations. I still had a pulse. I still had hands. I still had the ability to walk into a hall and claim a seat, not as someone's mother, not as someone's burden, but as myself. The next day, while they were both at work, I took the bus into the city. It had been years since I had done something so ordinary alone, years since I had looked at schedules, bought a ticket, found my way through crowded streets without someone rushing me along. My knees ached, my back protested, but each step felt like a small reclamation, like I was proving to myself that I had not yet been erased, I walked past shop windows, past women younger than my children carrying bags of expensive clothes, and I thought, I do not need to dress like them. I do not need to move like them. I only need to arrive at the place that has always made me feel alive. At the box office of the Opera House, I waited in line behind a pair of students, arguing about seating, and when my turn came, I asked, with a voice that trembled only slightly, for one ticket. Not the gala, not the box, not the polished event my son would have chosen, but a simple seat in the parlor, close enough to see the performer's breath. The woman behind the counter gave me a look I could not decipher. Pity, perhaps, or surprise, but she printed the ticket and slid it toward me. I held it as though it were a passport, proof that I was still allowed to cross into a world of sound without permission from anyone else. That evening, I dressed carefully. Not in anything new, nothing fashionable, just the navy dress I had worn the night my son scolded me, because I wanted to reclaim it, to remind myself that the shame was not mine. I pinned my hair back, applied a touch of lipstick, the same shade I had worn in my 30s, and when I looked in the mirror, I did not see an old woman in exile. I saw someone who still had the right to arrive. I took the bus again, clutching my handbag, the ticket safe inside, and when I stepped into the grand lobby, I felt the same nervous exhilaration I had felt as a young bride. I belonged there. Not because my son had granted me entry, but because I had come on my own. Inside, the house was alive with anticipation, voices echoing, lights glinting off polished brass. I found my seat, sat down, and let the noise wash over me. No one knew who I was. No one cared if I clapped or if I stayed silent. No one measured my presence against their image. I was free in a way I had not been in years. When the lights dimmed and the first notes rose from the pit, I closed my eyes and felt my chest expand, not with shame, not with hesitation, but with the certainty that I was still alive, still capable of joy. And in that moment, something in me shifted permanently. I would not wait again for permission to love what I loved. I would not ask to be included. I would take my place quietly if necessary, but firmly, because I was not ready to be written out of my own life. That night was not dramatic in the eyes of anyone else. To the strangers around me, it was just another performance, another evening out. But to me, it was the beginning of a new chapter, the midpoint in a story I had not realized I was still writing. For when I walked out into the night afterward, my ears ringing, my heart steady, I no longer felt like someone diminished. I felt, for the first time in years, like someone who had chosen her own way. The past has a way of returning just when you begin to feel safe, and mine returned, not with a knock at the door or a letter in the mail, but in the form of eyes I recognized across the gilded hall of the Opera House on the night I had thought was mine alone. I had bought the ticket with my own money, taken the bus again, walked up the grand steps with the slow dignity of someone who knows she belongs, and I had sat down ready to lose myself in the overture when I felt it, that prickling sensation that tells you someone is watching. I turned, and there he was, my son, standing at the end of the row with his wife on his arm, their clothes sharp, their posture elegant, their eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on me. For a second he looked confused, as though he had seen a ghost, and then his face hardened into something else, a tightness around the jaw that told me he was not surprised, but angry, not curious, but exposed. He had not expected to find me there, alone, on my own terms, and I understood in that instant that my quiet act of reclaiming had somehow threatened the fragile story he told about who he was and who I was allowed to be. The first intermission was unbearable. I stood in the lobby sipping a glass of water, pretending to study the marble pillars, when I heard his voice behind me, low and urgent. "What are you doing here, Mom?" It was not a question of care, but of control. A question meant to remind me that my place was not among these people. His wife added her own line, soft but edged. "We would have brought you if you'd said something." The lie stung more than if she had spoken nothing at all, because I had said something. Many times, I had begged in silence with my eyes. I had waited by the door like a forgotten coat, and they had chosen not to include me. I turned slowly, feeling the weight of every year in my spine, and I said, as evenly as I could, "I am here to listen to music." He frowned as though I had broken a rule written only in his mind, and he leaned closer, his words hot against my ear. "You don't understand how this looks." That was the heart of it. Not how it felt, not what it meant to me, but how it looked to others. His life had become a performance, curated like the neutral rooms of his house, and in that performance there was no room for an old woman clapping too soon, or laughing too loud, or daring to exist without being managed. I told him calmly that it looked exactly as it was, a woman attending the opera. His eyes flashed, his wife's lips tightened, and I felt them both recoil from me, as though my presence were a stain that might spread. They walked away quickly, merging with a group of their friends, and I remained alone with my water, my heart pounding not from shame this time, but from something else, something sharper, something dangerously close to rage. When the second act ended and the house erupted in applause, I clapped with my whole being. I clapped not only for the soprano, but for myself, for the girl with the ticket in 1968, for the woman in the navy dress who had been silenced and was now making noise again. And just as before, the conductor's eyes swept the crowd and landed on me. He pointed quickly, a flick of recognition, and though it might have meant nothing to anyone else, to me it was everything. It was proof that I was not invisible, that even in a hall of hundreds, my presence could still matter. My son saw it too. I caught the flicker of his gaze, the disbelief, the tightening of his mouth, and I knew then that the past would not let me go easily. The following days were heavy with tension. At breakfast the next morning, my son's voice was brittle. "You shouldn't go places like that alone, Mom." People worry people. Not him, not his wife, but people. Some vague external authority he invoked to mask his own discomfort. I smiled thinly and said nothing, but inside I felt the ember flare. He was worried not for me, but for himself, for the image of the successful man whose mother did not know her place. Later that week, I overheard him on the phone, his voice tight as he told someone, I assumed a sibling, that I was acting out, that I was being difficult, that perhaps it was time to think about alternatives for me. And I understood that alternatives meant confinement, the polite exile of elder care, where no one could see me misbehave. The thought chilled me, but it also steeled me, because I would not be hidden away like a broken chair. And then came the letter, slipped under my door one afternoon when I returned from a walk. It was from my eldest grandson, the only one who still wrote by hand. His words were shaky but kind. "Dad says you're upset. I just want to know if you're okay. I miss you." I remember when you used to sing along with the records, I read the letter twice, then 3 times, my eyes burning, because here was a voice that did not erase me, but remembered me, not as a burden, but as a presence that had once mattered. It was proof that not everyone had been taught to look away. I folded it carefully and tucked it into the book of scores, pressing it between pages as though to preserve both memory and hope. But the escalation did not stop. A week later, at the cafe where I sometimes lingered with a notebook, I saw her, my daughter-in-law, standing outside, her coat too fine for the drizzle, her eyes scanning the room. She did not come in. She only stood there long enough for me to feel the weight of her gaze, then turned and walked away. I understood then that I was being watched, monitored, that my small steps toward independence were being tracked as though they were crimes. When I returned home, my son's tone was sharp. "You need to tell us where you go. We can't have you wandering. as though I were a dog off leash, not a woman taking the bus to hear music. I said nothing, but inside I made a decision. If they insisted on calling my freedom wandering, then I would wander further, wider, until they could not follow. The second escalation was not just about exclusion, but about pressure, about the way the past tried to pull me back into silence each time I lifted my head. They did not scream, they did not strike, but they erased, they corrected, they watched, and they whispered. And every act was a reminder that in their eyes I had become less than myself. But the more they pressed, the more I felt that ember glow, the more I remembered the conductor's baton pointing at me, the smile that told me I was not entirely gone. And so I began to plan, not loudly, not rashly, but quietly, with the patience of someone who has been underestimated for too long. I would not let their version of me become the final story. I would not let their silence bury my voice. If the past had come back to test me, then I would answer not with apology, but with defiance, because I was not done clapping. Not yet. Not ever. The moment of climax, the irreversible turn, arrived not in silence, but in the roar of an audience, in the flood of applause that filled the opera house like a storm breaking after days of oppressive heat. It was a night I had chosen entirely for myself, a performance I had circled on the calendar with deliberate defiance, and I had dressed not for them, not for my son or his wife or any stranger, but for me. I wore the navy dress again, the one that had been shamed, but which I now claimed back, and over it I draped the shawl my late husband had bought for me at a market in Florence, its thread still faintly scented with cedar. I walked into the hall alone, carrying my ticket like a declaration, and I found my seat among strangers who looked through me but did not attempt to erase me. When the curtain rose and the first notes pierced the air, I felt that ember inside me blaze into something steady, not a flicker, but a flame. The soprano's voice climbed higher and higher, and I thought of all the years I had been told to quiet myself, to make less noise, to take up less space, and I felt a decision forming inside me, clear and unshakable. I would not be silenced again, and when the final aria came, when her voice broke into a cry so pure it seemed to tear through flesh and bone, I rose from my seat before anyone else, my hands lifting as if on their own, and I clapped with everything left in me. It was not a polite clapping, not the kind that blends into the crowd. It was sharp, insistent, unapologetic. My palms stung, my arms ached, but I did not stop, and for a long, suspended moment it felt as though I were the only one in the hall, the only sound echoing beneath the chandeliers. And then, just as it had happened before, the conductor's eyes swept the sea of faces and landed on me. This time he did not just point. He bowed his head slightly in my direction, an unmistakable gesture, and the audience, as though guided by some unseen signal, followed my lead and rose with me. The hall erupted in ovation, hundreds of hands clapping, feet stomping, voices cheering, and yet in the chaos I felt a stillness in myself, the calm certainty that I had reclaimed something that no one could ever take back. I saw my son then, 2 rows away, his face frozen, his wife's hand gripping his arm as though to steady him. He had wanted me invisible, silent, managed. And yet here I was, not only seen, but acknowledged by the man who commanded the stage, by the entire audience who had unwittingly followed my gesture. It was a reversal so complete that I almost pitied him, because I knew this moment would lodge in his memory like a splinter he could never remove. He turned away quickly, his jaw tight, but it did not matter. His disapproval had lost its power. I had made my noise, and it had been amplified by the hall itself. Afterward, as the crowd spilled into the lobby, voices buzzing, programs fluttering, I walked with a steady step, my chin lifted. People glanced at me, some with curiosity, some with admiration, none with the dismissive glance of embarrassment my son had cast upon me. One woman, younger than my children, touched my arm lightly and said, "You were the first to stand. Thank you." It was brave. I smiled at her, not because I needed her approval, but because her words were proof that I had not imagined it, that my presence had rippled outward. When I stepped outside, the night air was cool, damp with the promise of rain, and I stood on the grand steps for a long moment, breathing it in. My son walked past me, his wife at his side, their eyes fixed forward, their silence louder than any words. He did not offer me a ride, did not even pause, and I let him go without calling his name. That was the irreversible act. Not the clapping itself, but the refusal to chase after him, the refusal to apologize or explain. I turned the other way toward the bus stop, and I felt lighter than I had in years. On the ride home, I replayed the moment in my mind, not as a fantasy, but as something real, tangible, etched into the fabric of my life. I had clapped when I was told not to. I had stood when I was told to shrink. I had been seen when I was supposed to vanish. And in that sequence of defiance, something fundamental had shifted. I no longer feared the consequences because the act was done. The noise had been made. The recognition given. There was no undoing it. When I reached my apartment, the silence that greeted me was not heavy this time, but sacred. I removed the shawl, folded it carefully, placed the ticket stub beside the old one from 1968, and I sat in my chair listening to the echoes in my chest. I knew the phone would ring eventually, that my son would call, angry or pleading, that my daughter-in-law might send a message, carefully worded, asking me to be more reasonable. But for once, I did not dread it. I no longer needed their invitations, their approval, their framing of who I was. I had written my own scene, and it had played on the grandest stage. That was the climax, not in the sense of spectacle, but in the sense of finality. There was no going back to silence, no returning to the role of the woman who waits quietly in the corner. I had clapped, I had stood, I had been seen, and nothing they said or did could erase that. The baton had pointed at me. The hall had risen with me. And in that moment, I had reclaimed not only my right to exist, but my right to be loud, to be joyful, to be visible. It was irreversible, and it was mine. The days after that night settled around me not like a void, but like a gentle hush after rain, a quiet in which the air smells different and the streets look newly washed, and I found that even the small rituals of my apartment had altered there, meaning the kettle's first whistle sounding less like a summons to endure another long day, and more like the opening note of something I had finally chosen for myself. So I began to move through my rooms with a new care, setting the shawl back in its drawer as if returning a relic to its box, sliding the ticket stub beside the old one from 1968 and feeling the two pieces of paper rest against each other like the wings of a bird that has learned at last how to fold itself without apology. And when the phone rang, as of course it did, I let it ring until the machine answered, because I understood that I would no longer run to catch words that arrived only to diminish me. I would answer only to voices that remembered me whole. My son did call, not once, but several times, his messages a shifting weather of clipped concern and strategic silence, each one an invitation to step back into the narrow corridor where my breath had been rationed. And I did not step there again, not out of vengeance, but out of a steadiness that surprised me. Because after the ovation, after the bow in my direction, I knew I could live without the kind of love that begins with shushing and ends with a leash. The only call I returned was my grandson's, and when I heard his soft, careful hello, I felt the ache and the ease of being recognized. So I told him that I was well, that the music had been beautiful, that I would like to see him on a Sunday if he wished. And we met at a modest cafe near the square, where the pigeons keep their own time and the buskers borrow arias without shame. and we sat too long over lukewarm tea, as people came and went, and I gave him a program I had saved, the paper, creased and aromatic with dust and cedar, and I said nothing about family politics or ancient debts. I only said, "Come if you want. I have a spare seat next month." And when he nodded, I felt something in me settle into place. Not a victory, not a bargain, just the quiet knowledge that the thread between us had held. I bought an abonnement with my own name printed cleanly across the envelope, and the woman at the box office, who had never learned to perform concern as a weapon, slid the packet through the little brass window and said, in the ordinary voice that can feel like grace when you have been addressed for years as a problem to be solved, "We'll see you often then." And I walked out into the noon sun and let that sentence take up the space that shame had occupied. Because to be expected, to be seen as a person with a recurring place in a room is no small thing when you have spent entire seasons feeling like furniture that must be covered before guests arrive. On Sundays, I ride the early bus, the one that carries church hats and grocery lists and the soft talk of people who have not yet decided how to tell the truth about their week. And I step down 2 stops early so I can walk under the plane trees and past the bakery that smells of sugar and pepper and coffee grounds, and sometimes I buy a small pastry and sometimes I only breathe. And in this simple slowness, I have discovered the shape of a life that belongs to me, even when no one claps for it. I have my seat now, not near the boxes where people pose, but in the row where the stage feels like a hearth, and the usher who wears a silver pin and has eyes that have learned to notice gently tilts his head in greeting, and I nod back and think how often salvation is not a door flung open with trumpets, but a human face that remembers you between Wednesdays. My son and his wife still attend, and sometimes I see them, a flash of his profile or the cut of her coat in a mirrored column. And on those nights I do not alter my route or my breath. I do not hurry to the exit or linger as a challenge. I simply continue on my feet toward the music and then home, because the truest boundary is not a wall you build for someone else, but a line you stop crossing against yourself. I wrote him a letter once, not to explain or indict, but to place the truth on paper where I could look at it without trembling. My phone, I said, is open to voices that are kind and to questions that are honest, and it is closed to the sound of management. And then, because I am still a mother, I added a blessing that did not cost me dignity. Be well, may your days be good. And I signed my name with the careful loops my own mother taught me at the kitchen table when our lives were too small for any music but humming. There are things I do now that no one would find remarkable if they had never been forbidden to me. Small freedoms that glow because they accumulate into a life. I stand in queues without apologizing for the pace of my knees. I take the long way, through the park to see the fountain throw itself into the air and fall back laughing. I hum under my breath in grocery aisles, and when a child turns to stare at me, I make a face that sets her giggling, and I keep walking with the exact, scandalous comfort of being the age I am without asking permission to show it. I have brought the record player to the window and let the aria drift out so lightly that it can only offend a person looking for offense. And no one has come to my door to say the owa or vulgar word, embarrassing. And if they did, I think I would invite them in and pour tea and tell them the story in one long breath, the way the river tells the bank. Not to convince them, but to hear my own voice continue without dropping into the ditch. On my dresser there is a small box with tickets tucked in like folded birds, and beside it the old stub from 1968 and the new ones from this season, and when I lay them side by side they do not compete or cancel. They complete, 2 ends of a staff. That carries the same line of melody, and I thank the stubbornness of my hands for remembering how to clap. If you are reading this and you are a woman whose life has been pressed into silence by the careful hands of people who claim they are protecting you from embarrassment, but are in fact protecting themselves from the sight of your aliveness, I want to say what no one said to me when I began to disappear. You have time left, you have muscles left, you have a seat somewhere in this loud and complicated world, and if you do not yet know where it is, walk toward the sound that makes your ribs ache. Buy the smallest ticket you can afford. Arrive underdressed and over-ready. And when the moment comes and your body knows it before your mind does, lift your hands and clap, not to be seen, not to be right, not to win an argument, but because the skin on your palms is a drum that still remembers the way home. And if a son or a stranger leans in to hush you, let him learn the lesson the Maestro taught me, that a baton is only a stick until it points at a woman who refuses to vanish. And then it is a compass, and you are already walking in its direction.